For the 73rd year, leaders from around the world gather here at the United Nations. But beyond their speeches, what can they actually deliver? With conflict and humanitarian emergencies affecting millions across the world, is the UN doing enough to put people ahead of politics?
إذا قطعت أين ستذهب الناس؟ لا يوجد هناك أحد يعطينا كابونات غير الوكالة.
And as the UN searches for ways to stay relevant, could it soon be looking at a crisis of its own if it cannot stand up to threats by the US administration? Plus, the President of the UN General Assembly on multilateralism, Trump, and the other challenges facing the UN. I'm Rita Fakhri from the United Nations headquarters in New York. Hello and welcome to the program. Once again, heads of state and government are gathering right here behind me at the UN General Assembly. The theme this year is making the UN relevant to all people. Now, while the organization tries to renew commitments by its member states, it is facing growing challenges as some of the world's key leaders bring their own set of priorities.
France continues, with all interested parties, to spearhead this global fight against climate change. In the G7, we will be working to see the Paris obligations increased. Should someone be against, we shall nonetheless press ahead through new formats.
We continue providing our services to refugees every day without any conditions, without any interruptions whatsoever. We expect more generous and flexible support to Turkey, especially by the EU, which has prevented a large refugee influx to spill over elsewhere in the world, foremost to Europe, thanks to the opportunities it has provided for the refugees.
It is unfortunate that we are witnessing rulers in the world who think they can secure their interests better, or at least in the short term ride public sentiments and gain popular support through the fomenting of extremist nationalism and racism, and through xenophobic tendencies resembling a Nazi disposition, as well as through the trampling of global rules and undermining international institutions.
Iran's leaders sow chaos, death, and destruction. They do not respect their neighbors or borders or the sovereign rights of nations. Instead, Iran's leaders plunder the nation's resources to enrich themselves and to spread mayhem across the Middle East and far beyond.
Not only did President Trump repeat his call on all nations to isolate Iran, he also strongly rejected what he called the ideology of globalism. This has left many here feeling anxious about the future of the UN and its fractured relationship with the host nation. A relationship that has always been shaped by who is in the White House, from Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was instrumental in the establishment of the UN, to Donald Trump, who has called it a club for people to get together, talk, and have a good time. Here's a look back at the ups and downs of the US-UN relationship.
It's one world, as Wilkie said. It's a world in which we must all get along. It's my privilege to be present at the signing of the Charter in San Francisco, which is the first step toward the accomplishment of world peace.
Before the century ends, we should establish a permanent international court to prosecute the most serious violations of humanitarian law.
The United Nations must have backbone. The United Nations must be willing to uphold resolution. The United Nations must be strong enough.
We must embrace a new era of engagement based on mutual interest and mutual respect, and our work must begin now.
We can no longer be taken advantage of or enter into a one-sided deal where the United States gets nothing in return.
There is a new US-UN, and you are going to see a change in the way we do business. For those that don't have our back, we're taking names. This is a time of strength. This is a time of action. Thank you very much.
With US Ambassador Nikki Haley delivering this unprecedented threat to member states and President Trump's strong rejection of the International Criminal Court, how far will the current US administration go to undermine the global multilateral system? And can the UN remain truly relevant if it does not stand up to its most powerful member? Well, here to discuss the future of the UN in the Trump era, Philip Alston, UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. Alston is also a professor of law at the New York University School of Law. And Hugh Dugan, a former US delegate to the United Nations, also an adjunct professor at Seton Hall University's School of Diplomacy and International Relations. Welcome to you both, professors.
Thank you.
Professor Alston, to you first. We just heard Ambassador Haley deliver a radical change in tone and policy when it comes to respect for this multinational and multilateral system that the US itself helped forge 70 years ago. Is the US, as some in this building behind us fear today, a serious threat to the current international human rights infrastructure?
I think the United States has taken a range of positions which are directly contrary to everything that the human rights system stands for. The assault on the International Criminal Court, as you mentioned, the withdrawal from the UN Human Rights Council, the defunding of the UN's human rights program, and generally not cooperating with the mechanisms is a real threat to the system.
But the current administration says this, and President Trump himself said this. He said that the UN's Human Rights Council has been an embarrassment to this institution, that it shields human rights abusers and bashes the United States and its friends. In fact, you came under attack by Ambassador Haley for focusing in one of your reports to the General Assembly not on human rights around the world and in Africa as she wanted you to, but on extreme poverty in the US. Is that a fair criticism?
In my various UN capacities, I've been to Africa and looked at more African countries than Ambassador Haley has ever visited, I'm sure. But leaving that aside, I think when a report comes down that shows that the United States has 45 million people living in poverty and that their civil rights are seriously jeopardized by that status, and it says this is not an important issue and not something we're going to dignify, and then puts it into the mix as one of the reasons why they're leaving the Human Rights Council, it's a rather sad day.
It's a rather sad day, many people, Professor Dugan, believe, but you, on the other hand, say this. You call the UN's anti-American bias being something that is an issue of concern for you. Why should the US, though, be exempt from the kind of scrutiny that Professor Alston just mentioned that most countries have to face?
Well, I don't believe the U.S. is looking for any exemptions. It engages fully in so many other UN machinery that deals with human rights matters. The General Assembly, which opens today, has a third committee. Most of its workload is dedicated to human rights issues and resolutions. In fact, it's to the General Assembly that all of these other many subordinate human rights entities report ultimately to the full membership.
But yet, President Trump was very loud and strong in his rejection of the International Criminal Court, which looks into major human rights abuses, saying that it has no authority, no jurisdiction, and no legitimacy. Is that a responsible way for the U.S. to go?
And the ICC is not a UN entity. So
it is not.
No, it is not.
But it is closely related to the United
Not any closer than in any other international organization or any other treaty agreement between countries.
But as a defender, as an institution that upholds international law and human rights, is it the
law,
right approach by
international
the
law
Trump
would
administration?
imply that we give due process, that we sign up to agreements, and if we don't sign up to them, we are not obliged to abide by them. That's the case in domestic law as well. The U.S. has not signed up to the ICC, nor have many others signed up to the statute that created the ICC. Although one could say technically we may have signed up, it was never ratified. The Obama administration never tried to get the Congress to, in fact, adopt this as a full-fledged commitment either.
It was never ratified. The Rome Statute was never adopted by any U.S. president. But going this much further, is President Trump suggesting something much more serious here in terms of rejection for the prosecution of major human rights?
I think the relationship between the US and the International Criminal Court is rather closer in the sense that the US was a supporter. It participated very actively in the drafting. It has participated actively in referring cases like Libya and Sudan and others to the International Criminal Court. I think the problem we see here Professor Dugan is right that it's not technically a UN body, but if we think about the rule of law at the international level, the apex of the rule of law is the International Criminal Court. And to delegitimize that delegitimizes the rule of law. And I think that's consistent with what this administration is interested in doing, is moving away from a rules-bound system and being able to do what it wants to do on its own.
And can the US, though, if it continues down this path, Professor Dugan, afford to alienate so many here at the United Nations, all of the other member states who feel that they are being pushed around and threatened and
It would
bullied?
be hard to say that the U.S. is trying to alienate at the UN when its president commits 3 full days of work here. We can, for the second year in a row, witness the absence of the presidents of Russia, Germany, China. Other major powers have not bothered to come to the UN. This president, in fact, hasn't pressed it.
It's about shaking the foundations of some of these institutions.
Participating. It's
and
about participating
these other
fully.
heads of states haven't done that, to my knowledge.
They haven't bothered to participate and come to these important events. This president has dedicated 3 full working days. One goes back in time. I started in this work in 1989. Our Secretary of State delivered our address that we would have had today. Subsequently, the president would come for a half a day. The president has grown into 2 to 3 working days where we move the State Department to New York and have a miniature Department of State. We commit to participate here in ways that nobody else does.
How relevant is that, Professor Alston?
It's an interesting contrast with last year, where the United States sent a very low-level delegation, except for the president, and didn't show much engagement. I think that the US position of withdrawing from the Human Rights Council is a very serious blow. Again, Professor Dugan mentioned that the General Assembly deals with all these human rights matters, but the General Assembly, in almost all cases, deliberates on the basis of what the Human Rights Council has proposed to it. So with the US absent from that, I think it's a great shame. It's a pity for the US because the US has a lot of interests that it needs to defend, a lot of countries that it should be there to defend and to promote, and the rest of the system needs the United States.
And in this multipolar world, is it sound policy for the US to be withdrawing from all these international agreements and to be also threatening to cut funds here at the UN?
Well,
and now talk of it also leaving WTO, the World Trade Organization, and so many other
First of all, several of these, so to speak, international agreements are not international agreements. They are arrangements, perhaps, at most. The U.S. is firmly committed to the UN Charter.
The U.S. You say the Iran deal was an international agreement, just to give you an example.
The word agreement could be debated
it was also
because
passed by the Security Council.
It wasn't adopted by our Senate, which has the power of treaty in the United States. So it was more or less an executive action taken by the president at that point. So these are fine points which we could go into. I'm just going to reiterate that the U.S. is heavily invested in the General Assembly's its participation in the Security Council, the Economic and Social Council, the International Court of Justice. And all of these many resolutions that emanate from the General Assembly, indeed many of them start in the General Assembly Third Committee every year that deal with human rights. There are other mechanisms throughout the system.
Cherry picking, though. Can the U.S. afford to do this?
I think the picture is a bit more complex. I think it's true that there's been a straight-on assault against the World Trade Organization. The US is basically trying to kill the appellate mechanism, and that would really weaken hugely the whole trade regime. Climate change is the central concern in the whole environmental area, and there the United States has not just pulled out, but again is taking measures to the contrary. So I think this is much more serious, and I don't think pointing to the continued sending of diplomats to talk in bodies can outweigh the huge political message that's being sent at the highest level that multilateralism is no longer in favor.
I would have to say that the world is run by those who show up. And if you don't show up, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And if you decide not to show up and participate, that disqualifies a lot of, so to speak, pontification that we hear through the media or elsewhere. This is where the world's meeting right now, and you find many key leaders didn't come.
Doesn't it matter what is said, because just last year, President Trump actually threatened a country, a sovereign country, a member state here at the United Nations, North Korea, of complete destruction. Is it good enough to show up and words won't matter as much?
I wouldn't characterize it in that fashion, but what we heard
Well,
today was
words.
a defense of sovereignty. What I hear so often is that sovereignty is the problem. And when the Secretary General took the floor today, he was to have given a state of the organization to the membership. Instead, he went on to a thematic speech. He didn't talk about how he's running this organization as its chief administrative officer, which is very unfortunate. So we want to see the discussion be meaningful, of course, but we also have roles to play here. And the president emphasized the role of sovereignty in the world. It's not the problem. Sovereignty is the solution.
Finally, your thoughts, Professor Alston, on what we heard here today, President Trump's speech taking on Iran again, but also the fact that other emerging powers, Iran, Turkey, and so many others, Brazil, India, want to have a say at the table, not just at General Assembly, but at the Security Council itself.
I think that the statement that I'm an anti-globalist, the statement that I'm a patriot, is a fundamental challenge to multilateralism. Every state can say the same thing. They all stand up for their own interests, but the assumption of others is that their interests are best protected by cooperating more generally, not by singling out particular states, not by trying to create pariah states.
On this note, Professor Alston, Professor Dugan, thank you both very much indeed for joining us. The task of managing many of these challenges facing the UN, including the dynamics of the UN-US relationship, will be left to the new President of the General Assembly. Maria Fernanda Espinosa is a former Minister of Defense and Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ecuador. She's only the fourth woman to be elected to this position in the organization's 73-year history. I sat down with her just before the beginning of this year's session and asked her about her key priorities.
It is time that we bring the United Nations closer to the people, and that we bring the people closer to the United Nations. There is great work that is being done by the organization, but there is a need for better communication. There is a need to translate our work into the daily lives of regular citizens around the world.
But is the issue just about better communication? Because as you point out, there is concern around the world that this organization is increasingly marginalized, that it doesn't represent the voices of all of its 193 member states who, yes, have a seat in this chamber. But let's face it, for people outside of this building, when they think of the United Nations, they think of the UN Security Council, and not just its 15 members, but its 5 permanent member states.
Basically, the General Assembly is the Parliament of Humanity, is the place where norm setting, where the international and rules-based international system is shaped every day, and where we deliver policy and rules for issues as important as international migration, as refugees, climate change, HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, non-communicable diseases, and I think that's why I'm saying that communication is so important.
But there is a real palpable concern, it seems, this year. When we look at the budget of this organization, it has been slashed. Secretary General Guterres himself has sounded the alarm bell. Some say there's a financial crisis looming, with the US having decided to hold back on its assessed contribution, which is about 20% of the regular budget. How do you deal with this crisis?
I think that there is a need for greater commitment from all countries. This year is going to be very challenging because we are going to establish the new scale of contributions from different countries. This is going to allow also to improve the way the budget is built. But I think that also every country has its sovereign right to take decisions according to their national interest.
But some countries' decisions, although sovereign, are more consequential than others when it comes to all of these programs that you've mentioned. In the end, will the UN be forced to cave in to the Trump administration, following through on its decisions to defund UNRWA, UNFPA, and so many other UN programs, not to mention the public bullying and threats that have been made to member states, the poorer, smaller member states in this General Assembly hall for voting against the US?
My role as president precisely is to make sure that we have a dialogue which is constructive, which is respectful, and which is geared towards building consensus and agreement. And of course, there can be dissent and different views, but the importance of having this Parliament of Humanity is precisely to process dissent in a respectful way, to express their views on any issues.
And my role
as president precisely is to make sure that we have a dialogue which is constructive.
But so as president of the General Assembly, how will you make sure that everybody, not just the most powerful members in this chamber, will actually respect the decorum of this UN General Assembly? How do you make sure that what happened last year doesn't happen again? It's gone beyond money and the threats to cut funding. And let me just quote this. President Trump said, "The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea." So my question to you is this: will you allow Trump or any other speaker to threaten other countries of complete total destruction, which goes against the spirit of the UN Charter?
Well, I would say that it is imperative that every head of state, every head of government is aware of what the organization stands for. So it is a call for all heads of state and government that are coming to New York to make sure that we all respect the Charter and that we communicate with each other with respect and in a constructive way.
But it's not a joke, is it, when the president of the largest nuclear power makes threats like these? It might have been DPRK last year, but it could be Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, Syria this year. What would you do? Because a lot of people will be watching. They feel that if powerful members get away with this type of rhetoric, it beckons questions about the very essence and credibility of the UN if they do get away with it. How do you make sure that they don't?
Well, the truth is that every head of state, every leader of the world is responsible for its own words. And I think it's very important that this house is seen as what it is. It is the Parliament of Humanity. It is the house where we have to deliver on peace and security issues, on human rights issues, on development issues.
And talking about challenges, you said that strengthening multilateralism is not an option, it's an obligation. What would you do to change the discourse that's going on?
Multilateralism is the only way that we can address global challenges. It is an obligation with the people we represent, the people that are hungry, the people that are homeless, the people that are ill, migrants, refugees, women and girls that are victims of violent conflict. These are the people for which we should be a relevant organization.
Still ahead on the program, with so many ongoing crises, how effective can the United Nations be if it is unable or unwilling to respond when people need it the most?
المطلوب من الأمم المتحدة أن تتخذ قراراً صارماً بوقف الحرب.
And why the former UN Human Rights Chief says the Security Council must act before it is too late. Welcome back. From one unresolved conflict and humanitarian crisis to the next, Yemen, Myanmar, Syria, the UN is still struggling to live up to the first and most fundamental commitment in its charter. We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. And of course, all too often, it is power politics that determines the UN's course of action. Here's our Bigger Than Five brief. When the UN Charter was signed 73 years ago, 50 nations came together with one goal: building a peaceful world after years of war. Today, the 193 member states have pledged to uphold the principles on which the global organization was built. But is the United Nations living up to its promise of delivering for those who need it the most?
Some people are making it through today because of the United Nations. People who rely on emergency food aid, who are in a war zone. For these people, the UN is delivering. But if you're living in Idlib, Syria right now, today, and you're under the threat of being demolished by a Syrian government barrel bomb or a Russian missile or maybe chemical weapons that everyone will deny using, For you, the UN has been a big, fat failure.
Hello! A failure indeed. While the UN has been successful in providing humanitarian aid and assistance to millions of people around the world, it has been unable to address some of the world's most pressing issues.
Politics has always handcuffed the UN, and it always will. So anytime you want to do something substantive in the Security Council on Myanmar, you have to go through China. Just like if you want to do something on Israel in the Security Council, you have to go through the United States. If you want to do something on Syria, you need to go through Russia.
With these permanent members of the Security Council holding the key, there are growing questions about the UN's credibility and its continued relevance. And if the UN cannot take urgent action to solve the world's ongoing conflicts and crises, it could soon be facing a crisis of its own, a crisis of survival. Well, one of the UN agencies facing a serious survival crisis is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, which provides education, health and social services to 5 million registered Palestinian refugees. Today, it is left without its single biggest donor, the United States. The Trump administration's decision to cut all funding to the agency means that Palestinian families are already feeling the impact.
احنا بنعتمد على وكالة الغوث بشكل كبير جدا. الصحة والتعليم والبطالة والغذاء. إذا قطعت الصحة مين يعطينا صحة؟ تعليم أين سدادها بالآلاف من الأطفال؟ إذا سكروا المدارس وكان وين يتعلموا؟ يضلهم في الشوارع. قصة الكابونات هناك في معلومات يقول بدهم يقطعوها. نتمنى من الوكالة أنها تسعى ما تقطع هذه الكابونات. هناك آلاف من الأسر الفقيرة تعتمد على وكالة الغوث. إذا قطعت أين ستذهب الناس؟ وقتل الغوث حينما يصير حروب نذهب إلى المدارس تؤمن لنا الطعام والأمان. نتمنى على وكالة الغوث ما تترك غزة لوحدها.
Of course, the impact on refugees like Salman in Gaza is shared, of course, by millions across the West Bank, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, for whom UNRWA represents a critical lifeline. Peter Kayenbühl, the Commissioner General of UNRWA, joins me now to discuss the situation. Thank you very much, Mr. Kayenbühl. Give us a sense of how significant the $300 million US cut to UNRWA, which is, I believe, about a quarter of the budget, is for Palestinians, not just in Gaza, but in all these other countries as well.
Well, there was two types of impacts. One was an emotional impact because it came so quickly, this announcement after the debate on Jerusalem and the transfer of the embassy. So Palestine refugees saw the issue of Jerusalem, then the refugee issue. So that was a very emotional impact for them and a big worry about what would happen in the future. And then there's the concrete impact that we saw in your report for people from education, healthcare and others. People were extremely worried about that.
But how worried are you about an implosion in Gaza, in the West Bank? Because clearly for this US administration, education, health, development for the Palestinian is not a priority. The Israeli Army Chief of Staff warned that he fears that this could actually have a major impact, that it could lead to an outbreak of violence. Do you share these concerns?
Well, education, healthcare and our emergency services are a priority for us. And we're not going to abandon Gaza, we're not going to abandon Palestine refugees in the West Bank or in Syria, Lebanon and Jordan. That's what we're mandated to do, and we will stand very firm. And I've told Palestine refugees we are not going to fail them in that sense. Now, the challenge in financial terms was huge, and that's why we launched immediately early in the year a campaign called Dignity is Priceless to mobilize support from other actors. That's really our responsibility.
But can you cope without reducing some of your assistance? And when you say mobilize support, which countries are you mostly looking to fill this gap?
So the mobilization focused on all countries of the General Assembly of the United Nations, but we had very strong response from countries in the Gulf, from Qatar, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, and currently we are discussing with Kuwait still actively. We had in Asia, for example, Japan, but also China, and we had Indonesia and Malaysia very interested to support us, several European countries and Canada.
But these are still commitments, and we know,
these
history shows us that commitments don't always translate into urgent
these are more than
action.
commitments. And the beautiful thing about UNRWA is that we felt such solidarity that out of the $446 million that we needed to close as a shortfall this year, we've already mobilized over 260 million. That's concrete money that has reached UNRWA, and so you have to understand there's a very positive dynamic. We had statements from the French president, from the Jordanian king, here in New York again, about the need to mobilize additional support. So we're seeing a lot of things moving, actually.
But you're seeing enough movement to suggest that at this stage you shouldn't be worried about a cash flow crisis, that you have enough money coming and that you can survive like this for a while?
No, it's a very difficult year. It's existential in terms of threat, and we still need $186 million, so it's a very big piece. But of course, the responsibility that we feel when we just saw in your report, the family, or when I see the students, the 500,000 students in our schools, I just cannot imagine going back to them when they show courage every single day when they go to the schools through checkpoints in the West Bank or surviving in the middle of the Syrian conflict, and I would go back to them and say we have failed to mobilize the money. I just can't imagine that.
And by mobilizing the money, though, because I think that's your only solution, aren't you in a way easing the pressure off the Americans and the Israelis? Because after all, UNRWA, through its generous donations, is stepping in to render services that really should be the services rendered by the occupying power, by Israel.
The only pressure I'm interested in easing is the pressure on the Palestine refugee community, and they face so much pressure in their life from occupation, blockade, lack of freedom of movement, lack of employment opportunities, a lack of horizon. Anything I can do, and together with my colleagues, to ease that pressure is what is important, because that's the mandate we were given. We're not an organization that was self-created one morning by a group of friends. It's the very General Assembly that we're here in New York with that tasked us to do this. And so we will knock on every door, and it's not up to a single individual donor to define, the destiny of this organization.
But in terms of the destiny of the organization, when you look to the future of the organization, it's been heavily criticized by the US for giving Palestinian refugees so-called exceptional status and rights, in that you refer to refugees, anyone who is a new generation refugee is referred to a refugee. But is international law clear on this? Should all Palestinians be considered refugees, not just those who fled the 48 violence?
It's a very important point, because that is one of the greatest misrepresentations in the debate around UNRWA. It's a spectacular misrepresentation, actually, because it suggests that Palestine refugees are the only ones that inherit the status of the refugees, and sort of descendants are considered as refugees as well. Well, think about the Afghan refugees. Now for 40 years in Peshawar and the camps in Pakistan. And of course UNHCR considers their children and grandchildren as refugees, just as UNRWA does the Palestine refugee children and grandchildren. So there's no difference in that.
So what is the end game here for the Israelis and the Americans? Is it putting the Palestinian refugee crisis issue to rest once and for all, with the first step being the dismantling of UNRWA?
Well, that may be a temptation for some, but the point I think one has to have in mind is you cannot simply wish 5.3 million people away. And whether UNRWA exists today or doesn't exist tomorrow, that isn't the point. The people will be there, and solutions, political solutions, have to be inclusive of Palestine refugees as they have to be of refugees elsewhere. Otherwise, you don't stabilize the region.
But how much is the political issue, though, have to do with the desire by some, certainly the US administration, to possibly strip refugees, Palestinian refugees, of their refugee status? That this goes beyond the financial aid.
The refugee status, and in particular also the Palestine refugee status, is a matter for the General Assembly. That's a definition that has been approved by the General Assembly. And so it's not for an individual member state to define a change in that regard.
So
it can
should
be debated.
there be an emergency session of the General Assembly to deal with this?
I don't think so. I think the issue of definitions and others is maybe there's a temptation or a desire to reduce the experiences of Palestine refugees, to minimize them, to at times even delegitimize them. But my point about this is, however strongly these attempts are made, the reality is Palestine refugees have rights under international law, and UNRWA is an expression of the collective commitment of the international community through the General Assembly, and renewed regularly over the past decades, to provide support, assistance and protection to this community.
40 US members of Congress have called on President Trump to reverse all of these policies against the Palestinians, not just the defunding of UNRWA, but also the $200 million in humanitarian aid, $25 million to hospitals in East Jerusalem. What are you telling your US interlocutors, your Israeli ones as well?
I say to the US that, first of all, UNRWA recognizes, and I personally recognize, the extraordinary contributions that have come from US throughout the administrations and across, and it has always been a bipartisan support, that the idea that humanitarian assistance, despite tensions and differences of opinion that can exist between the US administration and the Palestinian leadership, there has always been protection towards humanitarian funding. And this is the part that I regret in the decision that was taken now by the US administration, because it politicizes humanitarian aid, which should absolutely be prevented. We work in a very difficult environment. UNRWA, like other humanitarian organizations, exist because wars inflict human suffering on a very large scale. And so we're there on these front lines. You know, we've lost a lot of colleagues in Gaza and Syria as a reminder of how concrete is the work and the commitment of this organization to human dignity and to the rights of Palestinian refugees.
And are you hopeful you can keep going?
Oh, we're very determined. We will be there and we will stand firm.
Pierre Kayenboul, Commissioner General of UNRWA, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much.
From Gaza to Yemen, where the conflict between the government and Houthi rebels is now in its 4th year. With ongoing airstrikes by the Saudi-led coalition, more than 8 million people on the brink of famine and 22 million in desperate need of assistance, the UN Secretary-General calls it the world's worst humanitarian crisis. As the UN engages in yet another round of mediation, Yemenis like Ahmed Ismail are still waiting and searching for answers.
دور الأمم المتحدة سلبي للغاية، خصوصا في القضية اليمنية. صح أنه المبعوث الأممي الجديد حاول أن يرضي جميع الأطراف، لكن في الفترة الأخيرة زادت الضربات والحصار القائم على البلد. حتى الآن أصبحت صنعاء مشلولة في ضرب مستمر وقائم في الحديدة الذي هو مصدر غذائنا أو مصدر استيرادنا للمواد الغذائية والسلعية. الناس قدهم جميعا معتمدين على هذه المواد. الناس بيعانوا معاناة شديدة نتيجة إيش؟ الغلاء الدائم، وإضافة إلى عدم وجود أو عدم توفر المشتقات النفطية. المطلوب من الأمم المتحدة أن تتخذ قراراً صارماً بوقف الحرب.
So how is the United Nations responding to these calls? Martin Griffiths, the UN Secretary-General's Special Envoy for Yemen, spoke to us earlier. Martin Griffiths, thanks so much for joining us, first off. So the Secretary-General of the UN today was again sounding the alarm bell, saying it's an outrage what's going on in Yemen and the fact that the international community has not been able to put a stop to this ongoing war. How would you describe this war? Is it a war in Yemen, a war on Yemen? What's your assessment of the situation?
It's both. I mean, it's a war in Yemen, pitching Yemenis against Yemenis, in which Yemenis are also the main victims, of course. The principal victims of this, as in all other wars, are the people who are caught up in it. It's also a war of great strategic importance. I used to work in Europe, and we used to worry a lot about the Red Sea security in the shipping lanes and so forth. This is because of the instability in Yemen. It's a war for stability in the region, and it is a war in which there are strong regional interests as a result. So it's a complicated war, just like some others in the region, but it's resolvable.
How is it resolvable? What is your game plan? I mean, because the negotiations seem to be stillborn. I mean, are you expecting much to come out of them?
Well, I think the first thing I'd like to say is that although it's been 2 years since the last round of negotiations, in that last round, which was 3 months in Kuwait, pretty well every issue that needed to be negotiated about the eventual settlement of this conflict was negotiated. We don't need to invent anything. It's all set out there in Kuwait according to and within the resolutions of the Council. So we have a big advantage. Again, unlike Syria or elsewhere, we kind of know where we want to get to in terms of what a settlement would look like. That's a massive advantage. All we need to do now is to get the parties together, started on the process of getting to that settlement.
But to what extent is it important to make sure that the Saudis, the Emiratis, and let's face it, their Western backers, the US, the UK, France, how much willingness is there to allow you the political space you need to find a solution when there's a constant, ongoing amount of airstrikes every day?
I think there's quite a lot of space. In fact, within the framework of the interests of the neighbors of Yemen, with their Western backers and so forth. I am continually told, I have been told again here today by one of the ambassadors from those states that you've just mentioned, that any solution has to be Yemeni. I'm continually told this, and I don't think people are lying to me. Solutions do have to be those which conform to Yemeni interests, but they also have to be consistent with the interests of neighboring states.
But exactly, I mean, this is no longer...
It's not a contradiction.
It's no longer a Yemeni conflict, isn't it? I mean, you mentioned the regional strategic importance it has for other powers, not just Saudi Arabia, the UAE, but Iran as well. And let's face it, these countries in the West that give the logistical and intelligence and
it is a Yemeni conflict. It is a Yemeni conflict. It has interests which are non-Yemeni, but it is a Yemeni conflict. It's about the future of Yemen. And as a United Nations official, I insist that the solutions that we arrive at are those agreed to by Yemenis. Now, that doesn't mean to say, and I don't think we're naive enough to think that other interests are not at play here. Of course they are. I frankly don't see them as a constraint on finding a political solution to the conflict, on finding, frankly, arrangements for a government of consensus, that will move us through transition. All the things, again, that were discussed in Kuwait.
Who holds the key, though? Because
who holds the key?
Who holds the key? Would you say it is Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the coalition, and their Western backers, or is it the Houthi rebels and Iran? And how much conclusive evidence is there that Iran is backing the rebels?
I don't know the answer to that. There are certainly very strong views on this matter, but again, and I've discussed it, for example, with UNRWA. I've discussed this with officials in the government of Yemen and the coalition. There's no doubt that the UNRWA is clear when they say that they get assistance from Iran of different kinds.
Is Iran supplying them with weapons?
That's not my business. My business is to find agreement to stop the conflict. My business is not to judge the performance of the war. That's the business of other people who have pronounced on it. But you said who holds the key? There are many keys to this conflict, just like many other conflicts. Some of those are in Riyadh, some of those are in Yemen, some of those are in Aden. The job of a mediator, of a UN envoy, is to find a situation where all those locks open, and that they open in a way that actually meets the needs of Yemenis.
But is it pointless, though, for you to be trying to find a solution when you've got this asymmetrical conflict going on?
Which internal conflict is not asymmetric? I think all the conflicts I've been dealing with in the last 25 years are asymmetric. Whether it's the Taliban in Afghanistan, whether it's looking at the Kurdish conflict in Turkey, the asymmetry doesn't mean to say that conflicts cannot be resolved.
But are you calling for a truce, for a stop to the bombardments, to be able to achieve your job?
I would love a truce to happen, but I will not make it a condition of talks.
What is the key condition?
The key condition for talks is the presence of both parties to sit down to negotiate an end to this war. You ask any mediator about conditionality, and they will all say, we love to have certain things happen, but we don't want to make them conditions precedent.
But what about stopping the arming of these different groups and factions? I mean, should you make it perhaps a condition that there should be a weapons embargo on all sides?
Embargo.
It's clearly not being enforced, is it? When you have some of the member states of the UN using F-16s to bombard the most impoverished country on earth.
You know, you're leading me down the same path that I just said I won't go down, which is, no, I'm sorry, no, my job is not to pronounce on where the weaponry comes from for this war, is to find an end to it. It's a different task.
It's not so much where the weapons come from, but it's how to put an end to their use. Isn't
exactly.
that something you're looking for?
That is what I'm focused on. That will come through a political settlement.
Finally, how hopeful are you? Because I know you were also involved in mediation efforts within the Syrian context. How much more difficult is the Yemeni crisis for you?
Less so. You know, I really, as you say, I had spent a lot of time on Syria without any noticeable impact. I'd hate Yemen to continue towards where Syria is today. And I fear that it could if we don't get the people around the table to resolve it. Every conflict of this kind that keeps moving always moves in the wrong direction, and our job is to stop it moving and move it back in the right direction. Can be done. Let's hope.
I hope so too. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Despite the UN's failure to help end the war in Yemen and criticisms of inefficiency and political bias, the organization is still a key provider for millions around the world. Aus Haidari with a brief look at some of the UN's most notable achievements in our 5 facts.
The UN assists 68.5 million refugees in 128 countries. With nearly 1 person being forcibly displaced every 2 seconds, UN agencies provide life-saving help to people threatened by violence, conflict, and persecution. The UN saves 3 million children each year. UNICEF and other agencies provide vaccinations for 45% of children under the age of 5 through immunization programs in over 100 countries. The UN provides food to 80 million people annually. The United Nations World Food Programme delivers food assistance in over 80 countries. Each day, over 5,000 trucks, 20 ships, and 92 planes distribute approximately 12.6 billion rations. There are 15 UN peacekeeping operations around the world today. With an annual budget that is less than 0.5% of global military spending, more than 117,000 Blue Helmet peacekeepers work to stabilize some of the world's most volatile conflict zones. These missions are often the difference between life and death for many civilians in these areas. The UN supports reproductive health care in over 150 countries. Through its population fund, every month help is provided to more than 1 million pregnant women who face life-threatening complications. Since the establishment of the fund, nearly 13 million unintended pregnancies, 30,000 maternal deaths, and more than 1 million unsafe abortions were all averted.
For so many, it is this kind of work that continues to make the UN an essential organization. But for the UN's former human rights chief, protecting the organization's ability to deliver will depend on breaking the deadlock inside the Security Council. Zaid Rad al-Hussein shared with us his thoughts and concerns for the UN's future.
In preparing for my post-UN career, I was talking to a publisher, and the publisher was very clear with me. He said that the UN doesn't sell. If you write a book about what's been happening in New York, Geneva, Vienna, no one is really interested, and that is a reflection perhaps of how the public more generally sees the UN, which is sad. On the other hand, and this is a point he also made clear, that the UN does sell when you refer to the activities in the field. You know, all the heroism that humanitarian workers are involved in the most pressing of areas, and human rights officials. And he said that actually does bring some attention to the UN, which is positive, or not just some, a great deal. And so that gives me a sort of indication that we are relevant in the areas that need us the most. Perhaps in the global north, the UN could be more relevant, and if only the mechanisms and systems worked better, such as the UN Security Council in particular.
And you, more than anyone else, in terms of senior leadership at the UN, has spoken out for so many human rights victims around the world.
Yes.
Myanmar, but so many other countries as well. On Syria, for example, or on other issues we often hear about, how do you break the logjam that we see at the Council? Because without the permanent 5 members, nothing really moves.
Yes. I mean, I was astonished when they didn't allow me to speak. We didn't have 9 votes. that would have allowed me to speak. And for me, it was an absurd situation, because if we don't discuss gross human rights violations in Syria in the Security Council, what are the Security Council members discussing about Syria? And I said, sort of tongue-in-cheek, are they discussing arts and crafts in Damascus? I mean, it's sort of, there's an absurdity here, and the Security Council really does need to understand more fully that today's gross human rights violations are tomorrow's conflicts. And if they're not attended to, they're not looked at carefully, it becomes almost too late. I mean, there are many extraordinary people in the UN doing amazing work in the field. My concern is that the UN Security Council itself seems to be paralyzed on so many critical issues. I mean, they can't seemingly come out with a resolution on Myanmar, for instance, after what we saw happen to the Rohingya. I mean, and that sort of thing, I think, needs to change. If it continues for another 5-10 years where they're paralyzed, then yes, that the UN may well collapse.
May well collapse if it doesn't change.
It needs to change.
How much do we still need the UN? I know you have worked for most of your career in and at the UN.
Yes.
How much do we still need it for global governance? Or could we think of something else?
Well, it's difficult. I mean, there are certain things that could be reformed. Certainly, in the UN Security Council, we'd like to see the use of the veto, and when there are atrocity crimes being committed. But again, when I go to visit countries and I see time and again in remote places UN officials doing the most amazing things, it leaves me feeling hopeful, and also their courage is utterly inspirational. So for me, I differentiate between the time when I was a diplomat at the UN and many of the meetings that could be tedious and we don't have an outcome, from the experiences in the field as a UN official working within the UN, where I have nothing but admiration, and I feel inspired by what these UN officials are doing in the field. So it's a complex picture. My feeling is that it's indispensable. We can improve upon it. It needs, the member states to be more determined to support it, not just in words and through speeches, but by real action.
With so much at stake, it is clear that many people here at the United Nations are sounding the alarm bells, not just about threats to the UN's political and financial infrastructure, but threats to its very existence. From Miri Dafakhri and the entire team, thanks for watching.